should have their children taught to believe that their own people, history, traditions, and culture have transgressed the rights of non-European ethnic groups.
For decades now, schools and universities in Australia and elsewhere in the Anglosphere have been teaching white children to be ashamed of their history, culture, and people. Australian schools fly the Aboriginal flag with the same visual prominence as the national flag. Acknowledgement of country ceremonies are also enforced at all public schools. This ritual tells Anglo children that their country does not belong to them and that by implication their ancestors stole the land. Children are taught that whites and Anglos in particular have been responsible for suffering and dysfunction in many other communities. The Rudd Labor government appointed Marxist historian Stuart McIntyre to write the national history curriculum. In 1999, McIntyre had written an openly Anglophobic text, A Brief History of Australia. In the final chapter, he wished for the demographic displacement of Anglo-Australians by Aborigines and Asians. Due to texts such as this, false histories of Aboriginal genocide and mistreatment are taught in schools, while counter-narratives such as Keith Windschuttle's 2002 book, The Fabrication of Aboriginal History, are ignored. Instead, students are routinely exposed to histories that criticise British colonisation and idealise pre-contact Aboriginal society. Examples include Bruce Pascoe's discredited 2014 book, Young Dark Emu. This theme is repeated in many historical and literary publications. As recently as 2021, Kate Holden's book, The Winter Road, offered explicitly anti-Anglo and anti-European criticisms of settler culture. Holden, a regular contributor to the progressive press, mocked Australians', quote, morbid fixation, unquote, with hard-working settler farmers. Even the wheat they grew, quote, fitted wonderfully into the racist, nationalist, agrarian culture of white Australia on the eve of Federation, unquote. How could wheat evoke white racism? Because of its, quote, biblical associations, its satiny fields, its satisfying ceremonies, its European heritage, and even its blondness, unquote. The book was favourably reviewed in the mainstream press. Historical reflection can be positive on the personal and societal levels, but it is not acceptable to present ideology and ethnic vilification as history. Attempts to put the history of Western and European people in a positive light are opposed. For instance, efforts by the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation to promote the study of Western civilisation were rejected by at least 2 leading Australian universities. At both the Australian National University and Sydney University, staff were opposed to portraying Western and Anglo identity in positive terms. Anti-Anglo hate is widespread in the Australian educational system. An example is Andrew Jakubowicz, a professor of sociology at the University of Technology, Sydney, who uses elaborate Marxist theorising to frame Anglophobic ideas. Typical of multicultural ideologues, Jakubowicz simultaneously calls for minorities to organise ethnically to advance their interests while denying the legitimacy of white Australians doing the same. In particular, he advises Chinese Australians to organise an ethnic lobby to oppose what he sees as a racist Anglo-Australia. Jakubowicz has a special problem with white Christian Australia. For example, he invidiously racialised the debate over Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act by describing those opposed to this legislation as well-off white Christian men engaged in a, quote, bigot's frenzy, who were also the majority of those previously complained against under 18C, unquote. He accused Australian journalists of suffering from too much whiteness and advancing white-only narratives. Nevertheless, Jakubowicz is routinely consulted by the mainstream media, including the Murdoch press, as an expert on ethnic affairs. He is embraced by the political establishment. Many years ago, the professor was hired by the New South Wales government to create a website to provide resources from which schools should teach about multiculturalism. The site still exists, carrying Anglophobic lesson formats and literature. For example, the website criticizes objections to Asianization and excessive immigration, which it mocks with articles such as, quote, Voices of the Past in Anglo Primal Scream by historian Peter Cochrane. This contemptuous attitude towards white ethnic sentiment is typical of left multiculturalism, upon which Yakubovitz has been a seminal influence. The Australian experience of Anglophobic school curricula is also apparent overseas. An example was provided by the British educationalist Calvin Robinson, who reported observing anti-white racism in London schools in the 2010s, where whites were in the minority. Robinson concluded that British authorities worked against parental values. He saw the far-left indoctrination conducted across Britain as targeting white pupils and recommended that parents take their children out of school and educate them at home.